The Blackwood No. 7 colliery was not built, it was swallowed. It was a scar on the unforgiving Pennsylvanian landscape, a jagged, dark mouth that led down to the absolute silence of the earth. By the autumn of 1898, the mine had already earned its reputation, not for richness, but for the bone-deep misery of its seams. Deepest of all was the shadow seam, a narrow, twisting vein so far removed from the shaft bottom that the surface light was a forgotten memory. It was perpetually damp, the air thick and clinging, heavy with a fine, choking powder that miners called dust, but which felt more like pulverized despair. This was the domain of the midnight crew, Silas, Thomas, and young Davy. Silas, the eldest, worked with a grinding, pragmatic fury. His pickaxe swung not with rhythm, but with a desperate need to break the rock and find the coal, to earn his way back to the air. His shoulders were corded rope, his face a map of the tunnel walls. He didn't believe in ghosts, he believed in tonnage. Next was Thomas, the brooding counterpoint. He was the one holding the light in the famous photograph, and the only one who seemed to look past the job. Thomas worked, but his mind was on the subtle creaks of the timbers, the strange, cold drafts that had no source, and the way the darkness in the shadow seemed to absorb the light rather than merely reflect it. And then there was Davy, the apprentice, barely old enough to shave. He had the worst job, shoveling the broken coal into the heavy iron barrow. Davy was a bundle of nerves, constantly glancing over his shoulder, convinced that every shadow held a lurking presence. He often whispered that this section of the mine felt too tight, like the walls were pressing in, trying to suffocate them. They were working deeper tonight than they ever had. The seam was closing in, forcing them to stoop. The air was dead. "Thomas," Silas grunted, pausing, his chest heaving. "That lamp of yours, it's doing no good down here. The gas lamps give a steadier light." Thomas ignored him, holding his antiquated oil lantern higher. The flame fluttered, fragile and yellow, casting long, unstable shadows that danced like mocking spirits. "The gas lamps," Thomas rasped, his voice strangely hollow. "They lie. They promise a world that isn't there. This old light, this shows you the real darkness, Silas. And I have a feeling the darkness down here is starting to look back." A bead of cold sweat tracked down Davy's neck. He dropped his shovel with a clang that seemed monstrously loud in the oppressive silence. The shadow seam was not just a geological layer. It was a forgotten grave, and tonight, it felt like they had finally reached the bottom. In the Blackwood No. 7, every miner carried a light, but only Thomas carried a ghost. The other men, Silas included, used the modern safety lamps, little brass cages that burned a steady, contained gas flame. They were reliable, certified, and above all, safe. Thomas refused them. His light was an antique oil lantern, a heavy iron thing with thick, warped glass that cast a uniquely yellow and unstable illumination. It was a relic his own father had carried, and Thomas claimed the modern lamps were a betrayal. "They lie," he had muttered to Silas more than once, polishing the iron casing with a piece of flannel when they stopped for water. "They shield the fire, they cage the light. They promise there's nothing out there that fire can't handle. But the real fire, it's meant to scare the darkness off, not hide from it." Silas found Thomas's obsession with the lantern an irritating blend of sentimentality and reckless superstition. The truth was, deep down in the shadow seam, the light struggled, regardless of its source. The intense pressure and the sheer volume of surrounding rock made the light feel thin, as if it was being actively consumed by the heavy blackness. This pervasive gloom seemed to amplify Thomas's eccentricities. He had begun whispering about the geology of the mine. He didn't speak of shale and granite, he spoke of tissue and bone. "You ever notice how still it gets down here, Silas?" Thomas had asked earlier that week. "Not silent, still. The water stops dripping, the rocks stop settling. Like the whole earth is holding its breath when we're here." The other miners kept their distance, especially Davy. The boy was terrified of Thomas's intensity, and the way the shadows danced particularly violently around the oil lamp's unsteady flame. Davy was convinced that the lantern's refusal to conform was an invitation to the spirits that haunted the deep. He watched Thomas's back, shuffling faster when the older man stopped to listen to the silence. Thomas believed the mine was a living entity, a vast, sleeping leviathan they were tearing apart, piece by piece. His lantern, his relic, was the only honest witness. It showed the darkness for what it truly was, not an absence of light, but a crushing, physical presence. As he held the lamp aloft that night in the narrow tunnel, its light reflecting off the slick, coal-dusted walls, Thomas felt less like a miner and more like a priest performing a dangerous ritual. He was convinced that the sleeping thing was finally stirring, and his old lantern was the only thing standing between them and the waking horror. He just didn't know yet what would happen when the light went out. The routine of the midnight crew was dictated by the hammer and the haulage cart. On this particular night, however, their rhythm was broken by something that defied the mine's normal cacophony of scraping iron and trickling water. Silas, deep into a strenuous swing of his pickaxe, felt the reverberation travel up the handle and into his shoulders. It wasn't the sound of shattering rock, nor the squeal of the lift cable. It was a thump. It was deep, muffled, and immense. It felt less like an impact and more like a profound pressure shift. Silas froze, his muscles tensing. "Blast crew," he grunted, wiping sweat and coal grit from his eyes. "Working too close to the main shaft." Thomas, leaning on his shovel and listening intently, shook his head. His eyes, catching the unreliable light of his oil lamp, were wide. "No, Silas. That was too slow. And too round." The sound had no sharp edges. It was a percussive, weighted beat. The kind of sound a mountain might make if it decided to shift its weight. Davy dropped his shovel for the second time that night, the metallic clang echoing sharply. "It's the rock, Silas. It's settling. We're too deep, it's going to." "It's not settling," Thomas snapped, his voice tight. "Settling sounds like cracking, like splinters." "That was a beat. Didn't you feel it?" They stood suspended in a strained silence, waiting for the sound to repeat. The usual noises of the mine, the gentle drip of groundwater, the whisper of air through the ventilator shaft, seemed to have retreated, leaving a vacuum. After nearly a minute of nerve-shattering quiet, it came again. Thump. This time, it was closer, felt through the soles of their boots and vibrating in their ribs. It was a single monstrous beat, slow and heavy, like the strike of a leviathan's heart. Silas, despite his hardened resolve, felt a genuine spike of terror. He was a practical man. Blasting crews didn't work this deep, and the nearest major excavation was miles away. "Whatever it is," Silas declared, grabbing his pickaxe again, forcing the fear down with sheer effort, "it ain't making money. Back to work. We hit this seam hard, and we get out." Thomas didn't argue, but he didn't move toward the coal face either. He lifted his lantern high, slowly sweeping the light across the slick, black walls of the tunnel. He was looking for a fault line, a crack, a sign of instability. What he saw was nothing, only the endless, featureless coal. But the air temperature had plummeted. The cold was sudden, cutting through their thick flannel shirts, a chill that didn't feel like a change in weather, but a loss of vital heat. It was an unearthly cold, the kind that steals the warmth directly from a man's bones, as if a colossal, cold-blooded creature had just breathed nearby. Thomas shivered, not from the cold itself, but from the realization. The deep sound and the sudden chill were connected. The mine was indeed holding its breath, and that heavy, rhythmic thump was its slow, agonizing heartbeat. Days after the first colossal thump, the midnight crew was on edge. The subterranean cold persisted, and the rhythmic sound, though irregular, had become a terrifying expectation. It was Thomas, of course, who made the discovery that escalated their fear into something truly bizarre. They were working a difficult, brittle pocket of the shadow seam. As Silas's pick broke through a particularly dense layer, Thomas knelt to clear the new rubble. He wasn't looking for the rough, familiar chunks of bituminous coal. He was looking for difference. He found it nestled deep within the gray detritus. Not coal, exactly, but something formed from it. He picked up several fragments and held them close to his oil lamp. They were small, perhaps the size of a pigeon's egg, but their shape was utterly unnatural. They were perfectly oval, impossibly smooth, and highly polished, possessing a dark, obsidian sheen that absorbed the light in a way the regular, fractured coal did not. They looked less like geological deposits and more like objects worked by hand, or perhaps, biological matter. "Silas, look at this," Thomas said, his voice hushed with reverence. Silas reluctantly stopped his work and examined the objects Thomas placed in his hand. The smoothness was startling. It felt cool, almost wet, despite being bone-dry. "Looks like some kind of petrified wood, maybe," Silas offered, turning the shard over. "Or an old stream rock." "No," Thomas countered, his eyes shining with feverish excitement. "Coal is fractured. It's sharp. This has been smoothed. It's been molded." As Silas held the piece, he felt a faint, insistent vibration emanating from within the stone. It wasn't a tremor from the mine. It was internal. It was subtle, like the hum of a distant electrical current, or a tiny, captive insect trying to escape its shell. Davy, watching from the wheelbarrow, covered his mouth with a dusty hand. He'd seen the fear on Thomas's face transform into a terrifying fixation. "Put it down, Thomas," the boy pleaded. "They're bad luck. They're the devil's stones." Thomas ignored him, gathering more of the strange fragments, treating them with a delicacy he never showed the tools of his trade. He placed them in the deep pocket of his waistcoat, listening to their collective, faint hum. He no longer believed the mine was merely a place where men dug for fuel. He believed they had penetrated the outer shell of something colossal and organic. If the mine was the lung, then these polished ovals were the seeds, the eggs, or perhaps the crystallized tissue of the living thing that lay sleeping beneath the state of Pennsylvania. The practical miner in Silas was whispering money. This unique, polished rock might fetch a price in the city. But the terrified man in Thomas knew better. These were not commodities. They were proof. And they were buzzing with the heartbeat of the abyss. The discovery of the petals of stone drove a wedge between Silas and Thomas. Silas wanted to dismiss the humming, polished ovals as a geological oddity, perhaps even a potential prophet. Thomas saw them as a terrible confirmation. That night, after the shift had ended and they were sharing a meager dinner near the main shaft, Thomas finally spoke the quiet, terrifying thought that had been consuming him. Davy had gone ahead, eager to escape the subterranean chill. "The mine isn't dead rock, Silas," Thomas whispered, his eyes fixed on the heavy darkness of the sealed shadow seam entrance. "It's not earth we're breaking. We've gone too deep. We've hit tissue." Silas stared, chewing slowly. "You're talking madness, Thomas. It's granite and coal." "It's a lung," Thomas insisted, leaning closer. "Think about the thumping. It's too slow for a machine, too big for a rockfall. It's a heartbeat. A prehistoric one, buried since the world was molten." He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the smooth, dark ovals. The faint vibration against Silas's ear was undeniable. "And these," Thomas continued, turning the stone in his palm, "these are the proof. They aren't fractures, they're seeds. Or maybe calcified blood. The mine's trying to exhale, Silas. The coal dust. That's its breath." Silas felt a profound, cold dread settle over him. He had always relied on the logical world of engineering and effort. Thomas was offering an explanation of pure, eldritch horror. Yet, the way the air had changed, the persistent, bone-aching chill, the terrifying slowness of the thumps, it all lent a dreadful weight to Thomas's madness. "We need to tell the supervisor," Silas said, pushing his food away. Thomas laughed, a dry, cracked sound. "Tell him what? That the earth is alive and angry? They'll lock us up, or worse, they'll send us back down with longer fuses. No. We know what we've disturbed. We have to be the ones to figure out how to put it back to sleep." He tucked the vibrating stone back into his waistcoat. The confession had been made. They were no longer simple miners. They were trespassers in the tomb of a sleeping god, and the god was starting to stir. With the discovery of the polished stones and Thomas's terrible confession, An unspoken rule settled over the midnight crew: act normal. They had to work, they had to haul the coal, and they had to pretend that the mine was not a colossal, breathing beast. But the fear was a constant, suffocating passenger. Silas, the pragmatist, found himself torn. He needed the wages, yet every swing of his pick felt like an act of provocation. He wanted to sell the unique stones, to prove they were just mineral deposits, but Thomas guarded his pocket full of petals like they were keys to a vault. Thomas, meanwhile, had become more withdrawn and intense. He spent his breaks listening to the faint, internal hum of the ovals, ignoring the necessity of digging. He was not mining for coal anymore, he was listening for life. The stress manifested worst in Davy. The young man's paranoia was now a crippling physical fear. He started marking the tunnel wall with chalk, a simple, dusty line at the point where his wheelbarrow reached the main working face. "What's that for, boy?" Silas asked sharply one morning. Davy wouldn't look up, his hands shaking as he gripped the shovel. "It's far enough. Past that line, the air changes. It gets hungry." He flatly refused to push the coal barrow past his chalk line. The crew had to waste time hauling the sacks of coal to him, slowing their output dramatically. This insubordination would have normally earned a beating, but Silas was too distracted by the deeper, more unsettling truth in Davy's wide, fearful eyes. The tension peaked when a foreman, Mr. Jenkins, ventured down to inspect the slow progress. He found Thomas kneeling in the dirt, his lamp low, tracing patterns in the floor, and Davy staring blankly at his chalk line. "What is this, a church service?" Jenkins roared. "Get to work. You'll be docked pay." Thomas simply looked up, his gaze devoid of fear. "You don't understand, Jenkins. We're working a vein of terror down here, and it doesn't care about your wages." Jenkins, unsettled by the miners' feverish intensity, quickly retreated, muttering about reporting them all. He didn't dock their pay, not because he was lenient, but because even he felt the unearthly chill clinging to the shadow seam. They were trapped between the need to earn their bread, the fear of the surface authorities, and the mounting, terrible knowledge that they were actively trespassing on something that was beginning to wake up. The mounting tension finally culminated in a violent, terrifying accident. They were working a narrow tributary off the main seam. Silas was struggling to wedge a new timber prop when the earth seemed to twitch. There was no deep thump, just a sharp grinding shudder followed by a cascade of small stones and coal dust from the ceiling. A piece of shorn timber, heavy and thick, swung down and caught Thomas's leg, pinning him hard against the rock face. A collective yell broke the silence. Davy froze, paralyzed by fear. Silas, however, reacted instantly, dropping his tools and shoving his shoulder against the fallen beam. It was too heavy. Thomas grunted in pain, but his eyes were fixed not on his injured limb, but on the darkness just past the reach of the lantern he still clutched. The dust cloud was thick, but for a split second, Thomas saw a movement. It wasn't the slow, settling dust or a falling rock. It was a shape, solid, fleeting, and utterly devoid of reflection. It was a shadow that moved on its own, detached from any light source. The shape, massive and impossibly quick, seemed to flow down the tunnel and vanish into the blackness. It left no sound, no wake of disturbed air, only a profound, cold stillness. "Silas! Hurry!" Thomas gasped, not from the pain of the trapped leg, but from the raw terror of what he had just witnessed. Silas finally freed the prop, hauling Thomas out. The older miner was pale and shaking, clutching his oil lantern with white knuckles. "Did you see it?" Thomas whispered, his voice catching. "See what? The damn timber falling? We almost died." Silas snapped, already inspecting the damage. "No, the shadow. It moved. It wasn't cast by light. It was its own thing. Like a blank spot in the universe, slipping back into the wall." Silas dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by shock and lack of air. Yet, as he helped Thomas limp out, the lantern's flame seemed to cower, shrinking away from the corner where Thomas had seen the impossible movement. The mine had given them a physical warning, a crushing accident. But to Thomas, It had given a vision, a momentary glimpse of the massive, cold entity that was waking up around them. It had marked their presence, and now, he knew, it was aware of their lights. After the accident, Thomas's injury forced him to shift his focus from mining to collecting. He could barely walk, so he spent his time near the main seam, sifting through the rubble. He was searching only for the petals of stone. His waistcoat pockets were now heavy with dozens of the polished, dark ovals. The fragments were no longer humming individually, they were vibrating in a strange, terrible unison. The collective hum was now audible, a low, insect-like drone that could be heard if you pressed your ear close to Thomas's chest. Silas, busy with the heavy labor now that Thomas was incapacitated, grew concerned. He watched Thomas place a handful of the stones onto the iron head of his discarded pickaxe. Immediately, the metal began to hum, not vibrating from Thomas's touch, but seemingly resonating with the frequency of the stones. The sound was high-pitched and distinctly mechanical. It was undeniable. The source of the vibration was external to the tools and internal to the stones. It was the mind's heartbeat transmitted and amplified. "You're going to draw every rat in the seam with that noise," Silas muttered, unnerved. Thomas didn't look up. "The rats are running, Silas. They're already gone. This noise, it's not for them. It's the sound of the earth changing its mind." He realized the rhythm of the thump-thump, the deep heartbeat, was growing faster. It was still impossibly slow by human standards, but the intervals between the colossal beats were steadily shortening. The sleeping Leviathan was not just stirring, it was becoming agitated. Thomas knew the truth. The closer they got to the heart, the stronger the vibration became. They were working on its very epidermis, and the creature was beginning to pump its lifeblood, its horrifying mineral essence, through its system. The stones were no longer a curious find. They were seismographs of the subterranean terror, pulsing silently in Thomas's pocket, counting down the minutes until the earth finally took a colossal, final breath. The final shift began on a Monday, and everything felt wrong before they even stepped into the cage. The air above ground was strangely still, the trees silent. Deep below, in the shadow seam, the atmosphere was thick, almost viscous. They had reached the furthest point yet. Silas was digging furiously, desperate to hit the vein and escape. Thomas, his leg wrapped tight, sat watching his relic lamp, listening to the intense, continuous vibration humming from his pocket. Davy was pressed against the wall, refusing to touch his shovel. Then, the air pressure changed. It wasn't the slow, normal equalization of a mine working deeper. It felt like the entire cavern had been suddenly and powerfully sealed. The heavy feeling wasn't a push, it was a profound, colossal suck. Silas felt the air thin instantly in his lungs. The pressure on his eardrums was immense, as if a giant hand had clapped over the mine shaft. It was the sensation of a vast, slow inhale. Ventilators jammed. Silas yelled, but his voice was thin, swallowed by the strange compression. "No, Silas!" Thomas cried, his eyes wide with a manic terror and understanding. "It's not a machine. It's breathing. It just took a breath." The silence that followed the pressure change was total. The usual sounds of groundwater trickling and far-off rock creaking vanished. All sound was deadened, absorbed into the suffocating atmosphere. The light from Thomas's oil lamp, usually a small, defiant beacon, now seemed dim and fearful, its flame shrinking to a nervous bead. It felt as if the sheer density of the darkness had become physical, pushing back against the illumination. Thomas scrambled to his knees, ignoring the pain in his leg. He knew that when something this vast inhaled, it was only a matter of seconds before it exhaled, or, worse, before it spoke. The absolute stillness signaled that they were now face to face with the creature's waking consciousness. With the air sucked thin by the colossal inhale, Thomas felt his terror mutate into a strange, manic clarity. He was convinced this was the end, and he had to see what was coming for them. Ignoring the pain in his leg, he struggled to stand, raising his oil lantern high above his head. He was searching the tunnel ahead, past the working face and into the deeper, undisturbed void of the shadow seam. But the light failed him. It didn't extinguish. The flame remained a nervous yellow bead. However, its illumination seemed to be absorbed. The coal walls, normally slick and reflective, now appeared porous, drinking in the weak glow. The light's reach, usually a meager 20 feet, shrank to barely 5. Thomas swept the lantern in a frantic wide arc, trying to penetrate the dense blackness. It was futile. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a smothering presence, a physical wall of oblivion that pressed against the feeble glow. "It's here," Thomas whispered, his voice thin and raw. "It's so big, Silas. It's drinking the light." Silas, catching his breath and reaching for a forgotten pickaxe, saw the look in Thomas's eyes and finally believed. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. It was as if the tunnel had ceased to be a passage of rock and had become the throat of a colossal beast. Thomas held the lantern steady, peering into the suffocating gloom. He was searching for the wall, for the coal face, for anything solid. But his light showed only a featureless, absolute blackness that seemed to have crept far closer than it should. He finally dropped his gaze from the consuming void, his chest heaving with desperate realization. He wasn't seeing the end of the tunnel. He was looking directly into the mouth of the thing they had awakened, and his little oil lamp was now its only target. Thomas kept the lantern steady, fighting the urge to run. He was looking for the mine wall, but the darkness was a void. Then, from within that consuming blackness, a terrible visual reality snapped into focus. He saw them, 2 points of light. They were not the sharp, bright reflections of a mirror, nor the scattered flicker of distant miners. They were low, steady, and utterly silent, like the glowing yellow-red ends of 2 gigantic, slow-burning embers. They were positioned too high to be another man's safety lamp and too wide apart to be anything natural. They were eyes, and they were staring directly into the unstable flame of his lantern. The recognition was instantaneous and devastating. This wasn't a cave-in, it wasn't a gas pocket. It was a conscious, colossal entity that they had awakened, and it was watching them from the suffocating gloom. Thomas screamed. It was not a human cry of pain or panic. It was a dry, high-pitched, grinding shriek that sounded more like metal being scraped over stone than a sound torn from a man's throat. It was the sound of his sanity snapping against the realization of the impossible. Silas, who had been scrambling to grab a shovel, stopped dead. He saw the twin, malevolent yellowish-red glows emerge from the absolute blackness. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but the sheer, ancient malice radiating from the embers froze the blood in his veins. Davy, the boy, simply collapsed, pressing himself flat against the tunnel floor, whimpering incoherently. Thomas, his face wet with tears and sweat, had his answer. The shadow seam was the beast's throat, the air was its breath, and those glowing embers were the terrible focus of its attention. The thing was inches away, and it had finally opened its eyes. He knew then that flight was impossible. They were already in the belly of the beast. With the 2 terrifying yellow embers staring back from the consuming void, Thomas knew running was useless. They were trapped in the beast's sight. His fear, compounded by the agony in his leg, twisted into a singular, desperate resolve. The mine had demanded a price. Thomas decided it wouldn't take them without a fight. He didn't drop his oil lantern. Instead, he gripped the heavy iron casing, his eyes fixed on the distant, silent malice of the eyes. He believed the creature was seeking the light, the small, bright irritation in its infinite darkness. "If you want the light," Thomas screamed, his voice hoarse against the dead air, "then take it." With a sudden, explosive motion, he swung the lantern down. The heavy glass chimney shattered against a nearby projection of coal. Shards flew, and the wick, saturated with flammable oil, was instantly exposed. He didn't flee. He didn't use the lantern as a weapon. Instead, Thomas took the burning, broken device and, with a final, primal yell, slammed the exposed, fiery wick into the heap of broken coal at his feet. The objective was not to escape, but to make a mark. He wanted to give the creature something it couldn't simply swallow. The coal, fine and heavily dusted, ignited with a terrifying, instantaneous whoosh. It wasn't a gentle flame. It was a hungry, oil-fed conflagration that erupted between the men and the approaching void. The heat was immediate and searing. Silas staggered back, blinded by the sudden blast of light and heat. He thought Thomas had gone mad, that he was trying to commit suicide and murder them both. But Thomas was still standing, silhouetted against the raging flames. He was holding nothing but the broken casing of his lamp, his expression one of horrified triumph. He had offered his only defense, fire and light, in a desperate, sacrificial attempt to deter the ancient horror that watched them from the deep. The oil-fed flames erupted with a momentary, blinding brilliance, pushing the darkness back for a few precious seconds. Silas shielded his face, expecting a massive concussive blast, a roar of fire, or a ceiling collapse. But the sound never came. The flames didn't expand outward, they were instantly drawn inward. The sound was not an explosion, but a powerful, crushing implosion. It was the sound of air being violently snatched away, a final, catastrophic gulp. The fire vanished. The blinding light was replaced by a darkness heavier and more absolute than before. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was the active negation of illumination. Silas felt the air rip away from his lungs, not blasted out, but sucked through his teeth. It was a suffocating vacuum that stole his breath, his vision, and his hearing all at once. For a fleeting, horrifying instant, he saw the twin yellow embers rush forward, no longer watching, but consuming. His last sensory experience was one of terrifying finality, the feeling of his own body weightlessly being pulled toward the residual heat of the extinguished flames. He heard no cry from Thomas, no whimpering from Davy, no rumble of collapsing rock. Just the dreadful, absolute silence that swallowed everything. Then, there was nothing. The light died. The sound died. The air died. In the shadow seam, the colossal ancient thing that had awakened had merely opened its mouth, and the three men, their tools, their light, and their final sacrifice, were gone. The universe, for a brief, terrifying moment, had simply folded in on itself. 3 days later, a specialized recovery team from the Blackwood management finally reached the location of the incident. They were braced for the grim reality of a devastating cave-in, shattered timbers, tons of fallen rock, and the pulverized remains of the midnight crew. What they found was utterly baffling, defying every known law of geology and mining engineering. The rescue foreman, Mr. Hawthorne, ordered the men to halt. The tunnel was perfectly intact. There was no splintered wood, no fractured ceiling, and no huge mound of rubble blocking the passage. Instead, the area where the three men had been working was scoured clean. The rock walls, floor, and ceiling were smooth, polished almost to a dark sheen, as if a colossal, abrasive tongue had licked the seam clean. All the familiar textures of the coalface, the fissures, the brittle layers, the rough dust, were gone. The tunnel was empty of any debris. They found no coal, no pickaxes, no shovel, and no wheelbarrow. The men's tools, essential objects of metal and wood, had simply vanished. Hawthorne ordered the air tested. The readings were initially 0, no methane, no carbon monoxide, and, strangely, almost no oxygen. The air was dead, heavy, and cold, but not toxic in the way a gas pocket would be. The most disturbing discovery was the absence of the bodies. After days of careful sifting through the perfectly smooth dirt floor, they found not a single tooth, bone fragment, or scrap of clothing. The men, their implements, and the tons of coal they were working on, had been removed with a terrible, absolute efficiency. The management understood the implications of the truth. A disaster of this type, an unexplained vacuum event that leaves no forensic evidence, would shut down Blackwood No. 7 forever and invite ruinous scrutiny. The official report was filed that evening. A catastrophic and unforeseen cave-in occurred in the shadow seam. 9 miners presumed lost in the crush of rock. The sealed-off section was quietly reinforced, and the entrance to the shadow seam was permanently brick and mortared. The truth, that the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed 3 men and all their belongings whole, was too terrifying and too inconvenient to ever be recorded. The clean, empty tunnel became the silent testament to the lie. The Blackwood No. 7 Colliery closed its doors officially in 1901, citing unstable rock conditions and poor yield. The ceiling of the shadow seam became a permanent feature, marked by a simple, sturdy brick wall deep inside the main tunnel. Outside, a weathered wooden cross stood near the main shaft, a silent monument to the 9 men lost in the crush, including Silas, Thomas, and Davy. The town of Blackwood never fully recovered. The memory of the midnight crew, however, did not fade, it simply shifted. The official story of the cave-in was accepted by the newspapers and the government, but the miners who worked the adjacent collieries knew better. They knew what a crush looked like. It was brutal, loud, and left a gory mess. What happened at number 7 was clean, silent, and absolute. The legend of Thomas's petals of stone endured. Rumors persisted that the smooth, vibrating fragments were never truly coal but were the crystallized essence of a primal force. Some said the creature beneath the earth had simply woken up, found its veins irritated by the constant mining, and in a single, colossal reflex, had simply cleaned the wound. Years passed, and the mine's surface grew over with scrub and tough weeds. The site became a place of dread and silence. But even today, the locals tell a final, horrifying detail about the sealed mine. If you travel to the lonely plot on a still, windless night, and you press your ear down against the damp, cold earth near the site of the former shaft, you can feel and hear it. It's not the sound of wind or groundwater. It is a deep, impossible reverberation. Thump, thump. It is too slow to be human, too heavy to be a machine, too rhythmic to be settling rock. It is the slow, agonizing, impossibly massive heartbeat of the thing they woke, the sleeping god of granite and coal, pumping its cold, mineral lifeblood through the veins of Pennsylvania. The shadow seam remains its throat, and it is merely resting. And it is waiting, patiently, for the next intrusion.